The air around the abandoned factory felt suffocating, as if Lucas had stepped into a void that time itself had forgotten. The rusted gates groaned under their own weight as he pushed them open, revealing a sprawling complex shrouded in darkness. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting fractured patterns across the floor, but even the dim light seemed hesitant to enter. Each step Lucas took echoed like a gunshot, yet the vast emptiness swallowed the sound almost immediately, amplifying the silence that followed. His flashlight flickered erratically, its beam dancing across stacks of collapsed boxes and cobweb-covered machinery. The oppressive scent of mold, burnt rubber, and something metallic clung to the air, making it almost unbearable to breathe. As Lucas moved deeper into the factory, his unease grew with every shadow that shifted. The factory floor stretched out before him, an endless labyrinth of conveyor belts and skeletal remains of machines that hadn't been operational for decades. And yet, the faint sound of gears turning tickled his ears, a sound too distant to place, yet undeniably present. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable hum of machinery starting up. His flashlight darted toward the source of the noise, but all he saw were cold, lifeless machines. Suddenly, the beam of his flashlight caught something out of place, a conveyor belt in motion, its worn surface creaking under invisible weight. No power should have reached these machines, but the belt moved as if following orders from some unseen operator. Lucas approached cautiously, his every instinct screaming at him to leave. His breath caught as he noticed faint handprints smeared in grease along the edges of the belt, as if someone, or something, had been guiding it. A sharp clang echoed behind him, breaking the suffocating silence. He spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. A single cardboard box lay toppled over on the floor, its contents scattered, old photographs and faded documents. He stepped closer, noticing that many of the photographs featured workers in grimy uniforms, staring blankly at the camera. One photo stood out, its surface scratched as though someone had tried to obliterate the faces. Among the scratched-out figures, Lucas could still make out one detail, a name tag hanging from a pocket that read M. Silva, his grandfather's name. Before he could process the discovery, a low, metallic groan echoed from above. Lucas tilted his head upward, the beam of his flashlight revealing a series of rusted chains swinging gently from the ceiling. They moved as though disturbed by an invisible force. His breath quickened as he felt a chill run down his spine. A faint whisper slithered through the air, barely audible but chillingly clear. "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, it cast a shadow that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing motionless at the end of the corridor, its silhouette distorted as if the factory walls were bending around it. Lucas blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the oppressive darkness and the faint hum of the conveyor belt behind him. His instincts screamed louder now, but the whispers continued, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. Something about this place felt alive, as if the factory itself was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. He clutched his flashlight tighter, forcing himself to move forward, deeper into the labyrinth of metal and shadows, even as every fiber of his being begged him to turn back. Lucas's footsteps faltered as he ventured deeper into the factory, the whispers and mechanical hum fading into an eerie stillness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. He moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping across rows of abandoned workstations, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of grime. His heart skipped a beat when the beam of light landed on something unexpected, a small, metallic object glinting on the floor. Kneeling to pick it up, Lucas froze. It was a tarnished pocket watch, its once polished surface marred by years of neglect, yet unmistakably familiar. Memories came flooding back. As a child, he had watched his grandfather, Miguel Silva, fidget with a pocket watch identical to this one, spinning it between his fingers during long, quiet afternoons. The watch had disappeared when Miguel passed away, its absence chalked up to a sentimental keepsake lost in the shuffle of grief. But now, here it was, lying abandoned in this cursed place. The weight of the object in Lucas's hand was almost unbearable, as though it carried the burden of something unseen. Turning the watch over, he noticed a faint engraving, for M. Silva, forever on time. A chill ran down his spine. The watch's minute hand began to tick, slowly at first, then faster and faster, though no mechanism should have functioned after decades of exposure to the elements. Lucas dropped it instinctively, but the watch didn't stop. It ticked louder and louder, the sound reverberating like a heartbeat throughout the cavernous space. The factory responded. The distant hum of machinery grew louder, as if stirred by the watch's presence. Lights that should have been long dead flickered weakly, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the walls. Lucas looked around, panic setting in, as the very air seemed to tighten around him. His flashlight caught something else on the floor nearby, a faded photograph, half buried under debris. Picking it up, Lucas immediately recognized his grandfather, standing alongside a group of men and women in worn uniforms. But there was something wrong with the photo. The faces of the workers were obscured, as if smeared by some unseen hand, except for Miguel's, which stood out in stark clarity. Behind him, the blurred outline of a massive, hulking machine loomed like a beast in slumber. A second glance revealed an unsettling detail. The smudges weren't random. They were claw marks, deep and deliberate, tearing through the glossy surface of the photograph. Lucas's heart raced as the whispers returned, louder now, closer. They were fragmented, half-formed sentences spoken in voices that seemed to overlap. "Help us! You saw it too! Run!" The temperature plummeted, his breath now visible in the flashlight's flickering beam. Something brushed against his shoulder, a cold, fleeting touch that sent him stumbling forward. He whipped around, but nothing was there. Nothing except the watch, which had somehow rolled back to his feet, its ticking now agonizingly loud. The whispers began to coalesce into something more coherent, a single voice cutting through the cacophony. It was deep and guttural, but unmistakable. Miguel failed. "You will not." Lucas's stomach churned. The voice was familiar, a warped version of his grandfather's, twisted and hollow. The factory seemed to pulse with life, its walls groaning, as if breathing in unison. The photograph slipped from Lucas's trembling hands, and as it hit the ground, the figures in the image seemed to move, their blurred faces turning toward him with hollow, accusatory stares. Lucas staggered backward, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was worse, heavy and suffocating. He looked down, and the photograph and the pocket watch were gone. In their place, a deep groove had been carved into the concrete floor, forming a perfect circle around his feet. A single word was etched at its center: choose. The weight of the past pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. Lucas realized he wasn't just here to uncover a story, he was part of it, and the factory, with its unseen, malevolent presence, was determined to make him play his role. Lucas's pulse pounded in his ears as the word choose, etched into the concrete, glared up at him, glowing faintly in the dim light. The air seemed to hum with an unseen energy, vibrating with an urgency that clawed at his very sanity. He staggered back, feeling the walls around him shift subtly, almost imperceptibly. The factory was alive, and it was watching. He tried to calm his racing mind, but every breath he took seemed heavier than the last, as though the air itself carried the weight of unseen eyes. Suddenly, the sound of grinding metal filled the room, sharp and jarring, followed by a guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a chorus of whispers layered over a deep, commanding tone, like 1,000 tortured souls speaking in unison. "You've taken what he left behind. Now you must give something in return." Lucas's eyes darted around, searching for the source of the voice, but he saw only shadows shifting unnaturally along the walls, as if they had minds of their own. Before he could react, the floor beneath him trembled, and a series of heavy thuds echoed from deeper within the factory. He turned toward the sound, his flashlight flickering wildly, illuminating a narrow hallway that hadn't been there moments before. The walls were lined with ancient, rusted gears and pipes that oozed a thick, black liquid. At the end of the corridor stood an old wooden door, slightly ajar, its surface scratched and splintered, as if something had desperately tried to claw its way through, or out. Lucas hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but the pull of the factory was irresistible. He felt compelled to move forward, each step taking more effort, as if invisible hands were holding him back. As he approached the door, the whispers returned, softer now but more insidious, crawling into his mind like venom. "Inside lies the truth. Inside lies the choice." The door creaked open as he reached for it, revealing a small, dimly lit room. At its center stood a workbench, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, and upon it rested two objects: the pocket watch he had found earlier and a strange, blackened shard that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. The voice returned, louder now, shaking the very foundations of the room. "One will set you free. One will bind you forever. Choose." Lucas stared at the objects, his mind racing. The pocket watch represented his grandfather's past, a relic of the man who had once worked in this cursed place. It seemed to glow faintly, as though imbued with some fragment of hope or memory. The black shard, on the other hand, radiated malice. Its surface was jagged and uneven, almost alive, and touching it felt like it would tether him to the factory's darkness forever. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden vision. The walls around him dissolved into a nightmarish tableau. His grandfather, Miguel, standing at the same workbench, holding the pocket watch in trembling hands while the black shard hovered ominously before him. Miguel's face was pale and drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror as he whispered, "I didn't choose. I thought I could escape, but it doesn't let you leave." Then the vision shifted, showing Miguel surrounded by shadowy figures, his body shackled to the factory floor as the walls closed in around him. The room snapped back to reality, but the vision lingered in Lucas's mind, chilling him to the bone. The pocket watch began to tick loudly, almost pleadingly, while the shard's pulsating glow intensified, casting the room in an ominous red hue. Lucas felt trapped, his options equally horrifying. If he chose the watch, would he risk becoming another victim like his grandfather, forever tied to this cursed place? If he chose the shard, would he lose himself completely, consumed by the darkness that had claimed so many before him? The whispers grew louder, their tone mocking now. "Decide, Lucas. Decide before it's too late." The factory seemed to close in around him, the walls groaning and creaking as if they were alive. He reached out, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his mind screaming with indecision. Sweat poured down his face as the whispers turned into deafening screams, urging him to act. Finally, Lucas's fingers hovered over the two objects. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his choice, the room erupting into chaos the moment his hand made contact. The factory roared in approval, or fury. As the walls began to collapse, the floor splitting open to reveal an abyss of writhing shadows beneath. Lucas screamed as he was pulled into the darkness, his fate sealed by the impossible decision he had been forced to make. The air in the factory grew colder, sharp and biting against Lucas's skin, as though the walls themselves exhaled icy breath. The moment his choice was made, the whispers returned, no longer distant or faint. They now wrapped around him, slithering like invisible serpents. The voices were fragmented, layered, and disturbingly familiar. Some sounded like his grandfather's, others like his own. Their words were incoherent, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, despair, and an overwhelming sense of accusation. The shadows began to stretch unnaturally, lengthening and twisting along the walls. Lucas's flashlight flickered violently, its beam fighting against the encroaching darkness. Then it died completely, plunging him into a suffocating void. He fumbled with the device, his trembling hands betraying his growing panic. When the light finally returned, it revealed something that made his blood run cold. The shadows weren't just distortions on the wall, they were figures. Human-like silhouettes emerged from the darkness, their movements jagged and unnatural, as if puppets controlled by invisible strings. They swayed in place, their heads tilting at odd angles, and though they had no faces, Lucas felt their hollow gazes piercing through him. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of sorrowful cries and angry mutters, filling his ears until it felt as though his skull would split. "Why are you here?" One voice finally broke through, clearer than the others. It was sharp, guttural, and carried an unnatural echo. Lucas spun around, his flashlight shaking in his grasp. The figures didn't move, but their presence was oppressive, suffocating. Then, with a sound like grinding metal, one of the shadows detached from the wall, stepping toward him. Its form was semi-solid, shifting and rippling as though it were made of smoke and tar. It loomed over Lucas, its head tilting in an unnatural, predatory motion. Panicking, Lucas stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of a conveyor belt. The flashlight clattered to the floor, casting a beam that illuminated more of the factory. What he saw froze him in place, dozens of figures emerging from the walls, their forms sliding and stretching as they materialized. Some crawled across the floor, their limbs elongating grotesquely, while others simply stood, their amorphous heads swaying in unison, like reeds in a spectral wind. Then came the whisper, close, intimate, and venomous. "You can't save him. You can only join him." Lucas's breath hitched as he felt cold fingers brush against the back of his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there. His pulse thundered in his ears as he picked up the flashlight, the shadows retreating slightly, but never disappearing. They lingered just at the edge of the light, their forms writhing as though waiting for something, some signal to strike. Suddenly, the machinery roared to life. Conveyor belts rattled, gears turned, and the deafening clang of steel on steel echoed through the factory. Lucas's flashlight darted wildly, catching glimpses of old machines moving as if possessed. A giant press slammed down repeatedly, spewing sparks into the air, while a cluster of packaging arms twisted erratically, slicing at nothing. The shadows seemed to revel in the chaos, their movements becoming more frantic, their whispers more insidious. Lucas's chest tightened as he realized the factory wasn't just alive, it was feeding off his fear. The whispers shifted, becoming more personal. "You left him. You let him die here. You've always run away." The words struck like daggers, digging into memories Lucas didn't want to confront. He shook his head violently, trying to drown them out, but the whispers only grew louder, overlapping until his own thoughts were drowned by the chorus of accusation. The light flickered again, and for a split second, Lucas saw a figure standing among the shadows. Unlike the others, this one was fully formed, its features disturbingly clear. It was his grandfather, Miguel, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and filled with unspeakable sorrow. "Lucas," the figure whispered, its voice cracking with despair. "Why did you come back?" Before Lucas could answer, the figure's mouth twisted into a scream, and its face distorted, melting into the darkness as the shadows surged forward. They lashed out like tendrils, gripping Lucas's arms and legs, pulling him toward the conveyor belt that now rattled violently. He struggled, his screams lost amidst the deafening roar of the machinery and the relentless whispers. Then, just as the shadows began to drag him onto the conveyor, everything stopped. The machines fell silent, the shadows froze, and the whispers ceased. The oppressive stillness returned, heavier than before. Lucas gasped for breath, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. But the silence wasn't a reprieve, it was a warning. From the far end of the factory, a new sound emerged. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic thump, like the beat of a massive heart. The shadows slowly receded, melting back into the walls, but Lucas knew better than to feel relief. The factory wasn't done with him yet. It was only just beginning. Lucas stumbled through the factory, his flashlight's dim beam barely piercing the heavy darkness. The rhythmic thumping that began moments ago grew louder, like the heartbeat of some colossal beast hidden deep within the walls. The sound seemed to resonate in his chest, syncing with his own racing pulse. His every step felt heavier, as if the floor beneath him had become a living thing, pulling him closer to some unseen doom. Shadows flickered along the walls, not as static shapes but as writhing, liquid forms that twisted unnaturally, mimicking his movements, mocking his panic. The whispers returned, softer now, dripping with venomous mockery. "Why do you run, Lucas? There's nowhere to go." They slithered into his mind like tendrils, intertwining with his thoughts. The voices shifted, taking on tones he recognized, his mother's, his grandfather's, even his own, turning his own memories against him. He froze when one whisper cut through the rest, painfully familiar. "You abandoned me." It was Miguel's voice, filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical blow. The factory began to change. The walls around Lucas warped, stretching outward like breathing lungs, the rusted pipes along them groaning as black sludge dripped onto the floor. The air turned acrid, burning his throat with each shallow breath. The flickering light of his flashlight caught glimpses of grotesque shapes in the distance, forms that looked human but moved in ways no human ever should. Their limbs bent backwards, their heads jerked at impossible angles as if caught mid-scream. As he pressed forward, the oppressive atmosphere began to toy with his mind. Shapes appeared in the periphery of his vision, darting away whenever he turned his head. His flashlight flickered erratically, casting brief, disorienting glimpses of the factory in grotesque detail. Machines that had once been lifeless now seemed to convulse, their parts grinding together in fits of mechanical agony. Conveyor belts twisted like snakes, looping endlessly, carrying nothing but whispers that grew louder and more frantic with each cycle. Then came the visions. The walls of the factory blurred and dissolved, replaced by fragments of Lucas's memories. He saw himself as a child, playing in his grandfather's workshop. The warm, golden glow of the setting sun streamed through the windows, illuminating Miguel's kind smile as he worked on a pocket watch. "Never forget, Lucas," Miguel's voice echoed in the present. "Time is the only thing we can never take back." But the memory twisted, the warm glow fading into a sickly green light. Miguel's smile melted away, replaced by a hollow, agonized expression as his body was pulled into shadow, leaving Lucas alone in the workshop. The factory's walls reappeared, but the damage was done. Lucas staggered, gripping his head as the whispers grew louder, each voice now taunting him with his deepest fears. "You've always been a coward. You couldn't save him. You won't save yourself. The shadows on the walls began to take shape, forming grotesque figures that resembled people he once knew, his family, his friends, but distorted, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish. They reached out to him, their hands stretching like tar, their mouths whispering his name. The rhythmic thumping grew louder still, and Lucas realized it wasn't coming from the walls, it was inside him. His chest tightened, each heartbeat feeling like a hammer against his ribs. His fear was no longer an emotion. It had become a physical presence, wrapping around him like chains, dragging him toward the factory's dark heart. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as the voices taunted him mercilessly. Suddenly, the factory shifted again. The floor beneath him liquefied, turning into a viscous, black sludge that clung to his legs, pulling him downward. He fought to free himself, but the harder he struggled, the deeper he sank. The whispers changed, now pleading instead of mocking. "Give in, Lucas. Let go. It will hurt less." His flashlight slipped from his hand and sank into the sludge, its light extinguished, leaving him in near total darkness. Out of the void, a figure emerged, tall, skeletal, and wrapped in shifting shadows. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated malevolence. It reached out a bony hand, and in its grasp was the pocket watch. The figure's voice was deep and resonant, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "Your fear is delicious, Lucas. But it is not enough." The watch's ticking grew impossibly loud, echoing through the factory, syncing with the rhythmic thumping in his chest. The figure stepped closer, and Lucas felt an icy tendril wrap around his neck, lifting him effortlessly from the sludge. The figure brought the watch closer to Lucas's face, its ticking now deafening. "Do you see? Your time is not yours. It never was." The hands of the watch began to spin wildly, and with each rotation, Lucas saw flashes of himself in different moments, standing by Miguel's grave, alone in a dark apartment, trapped in the factory. The realization hit him like a blow. The factory wasn't showing him his future. It was showing him his failures, his fears, and the moments where he had let time slip away. Lucas screamed, the sound swallowed by the whispers. The figure's shadowy hand reached into his chest, its icy grip tightening around his heart. The factory trembled, the machinery roaring to life once more. As Lucas's vision blurred, he heard the figure's final words, spoken with a chilling certainty. "You are mine now." The last thing Lucas saw before the darkness consumed him was the pocket watch, its hands frozen at midnight, its face cracked and bleeding black. Lucas's vision flickered as consciousness returned, his body heavy and his mind disoriented. He found himself lying on a cold, metallic surface in the center of what looked like the factory's main chamber, a cavernous space that seemed far larger than the building's exterior should allow. The air was thick, almost gelatinous, as though the very atmosphere had been corrupted by some ancient, malevolent force. Above him, massive gears turned silently, their movements eerily smooth despite their rusted, jagged edges. The rhythmic thumping from earlier was now an overpowering pulse, shaking the floor beneath him and syncing with his heartbeat, threatening to tear his chest apart. As Lucas sat up, he noticed the room's centerpiece, a monstrous, mechanical contraption rising from the floor like a grotesque altar. Its skeletal frame was made of corroded metal and pulsating tubes filled with a viscous black liquid. At its core was an orb of flickering light, encased in a web of shadowy tendrils that twisted and moved as if alive. The orb pulsed faintly, radiating a cold, oppressive energy that seeped into Lucas's skin. He could feel it probing his mind, searching for his fears, his weaknesses. Then he saw them, silhouettes standing in a circle around the machine. The figures were faintly translucent, their features warped and indistinct, but he recognized them instantly. These were the spirits of the factory workers, their forms eternally bound to this unholy machine. Their eyes, or what should have been eyes, glowed faintly, watching Lucas with a mix of despair and accusation. One figure stepped forward, and Lucas's breath caught in his throat. It was his grandfather, Miguel Silva. "Miguel?" Lucas's voice trembled, cracking under the weight of his fear. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the machine's core. The gesture was both a command and a warning. Lucas's mind raced as memories of Miguel's stories flooded back. How the factory's owners had driven their workers to the brink, how accidents and deaths were swept under the rug, and how Miguel had always spoken of the factory as if it were alive. The whispers returned, louder now, filling every corner of the chamber. But this time they weren't fragmented. They were clear and singular, as if the factory itself had chosen to speak. "You have come seeking answers. They come at a cost." The tendrils around the orb shifted, revealing a crack in its surface. Lucas felt a wave of nausea as the orb emitted a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a groan, as though the machine were in pain, or perhaps hungry. From the shadows, the skeletal figure from before emerged, its presence more imposing than ever. Its form was now fully solid, towering over Lucas, its face still obscured by a swirling void of darkness. In its clawed hand, it held the pocket watch Lucas had found earlier, now glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The figure's voice boomed, deep and resonant, vibrating through Lucas's chest. "You were given a choice, Lucas. Now you must see it through." The figure extended its hand, offering the pocket watch to Lucas. He hesitated, every fiber of his being screaming at him not to take it. But when he glanced at Miguel's spirit, his grandfather nodded solemnly, as if urging him forward. Reluctantly, Lucas reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of the watch. The moment he touched it, a searing pain shot through his arm, and his surroundings shifted violently. Lucas was no longer in the factory, but in a distorted version of it, an amalgamation of memories, nightmares, and something far darker. The walls pulsed with veins of black liquid, and the silhouettes of the workers now moved freely, their forms twisted and grotesque. They whispered his name, their voices filled with longing and anger. In the distance, the monstrous machine loomed, its tendrils now stretching outward like the limbs of a colossal beast. A sudden, crushing realization struck Lucas. The machine wasn't just alive, it was the factory's heart, feeding on the souls of the workers it had claimed. And now it wanted his. The skeletal figure appeared beside him, its void-like face inches from his own. "The only way to end this is to give it what it craves," it hissed. "Your fear, your pain, your soul." Lucas's mind raced. If he gave in, he would become another spirit bound to this wretched place, another cog in the factory's eternal torment. But if he resisted, the machine would continue to grow, its hunger unchecked. He thought of Miguel, of the other workers, their faces etched with agony. He realized that this was his moment, not just to save himself, but to break the cycle of suffering that had trapped so many before him. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lucas turned to face the machine. "You can't have me," he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. He raised the pocket watch, its green light now burning brightly, and hurled it toward the orb at the machine's core. Time seemed to freeze as the watch struck the orb, shattering it into a blinding explosion of light and shadow. The factory roared in protest, its walls trembling violently as the machine began to collapse. The silhouettes of the workers cried out, their voices blending into a deafening crescendo before fading into silence. Lucas fell to his knees, clutching his head as the ground beneath him gave way. The last thing he saw was Miguel's face, not twisted in agony but smiling softly, mouthing the words, "Thank you," and then darkness. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping itself around Lucas like a heavy shroud. His body felt weightless, yet his mind screamed with the weight of what he had just witnessed. The destruction of the orb had unleashed something far worse, a raw, untamed force that now seemed to pulse through the very fabric of the factory. The rhythmic thumping had returned, louder and more erratic, like the dying heartbeat of a beast fighting to survive. Then, without warning, a single light flickered above, illuminating Lucas as he lay sprawled on the cold, oily floor. Slowly, he pulled himself up, his limbs trembling with exhaustion. The room around him had changed, no longer the cavernous factory chamber, but a nightmarish amalgamation of twisted metal and writhing shadows. The walls seemed to close in, breathing and shifting, their surfaces etched with symbols that glowed faintly with a sickly green light. Machinery groaned in agony, their rusted parts grinding against each other, producing an ear-splitting cacophony. The air was heavy, oppressive, carrying the unmistakable stench of decay and burning metal. At the center of the room stood the skeletal figure, its form now fully realized. It was massive, its body composed of jagged metal plates fused with human-like limbs that dripped with black tar. Its face was no longer a void but a grotesque amalgamation of faces, those of the workers, contorted in pain, their mouths frozen mid-scream. The figure's eyes glowed with an unholy light, piercing into Lucas's soul. In one clawed hand, it held the shattered remains of the orb, now pulsating weakly as if clinging to life. "You think you've won," the figure growled, its voice a blend of countless tones, each more haunting than the last. "You've only angered it. The factory cannot die, Lucas. It is eternal, as is its hunger." The ground beneath Lucas began to tremble violently, cracks forming in the floor as streams of black sludge oozed upward, pooling around him. He felt the liquid pulling at his feet, cold and relentless, dragging him closer to the monstrous entity. Lucas clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had come too far to let fear consume him now. "You're wrong," he spat, his voice trembling but resolute. "This ends here." The skeletal figure laughed, a sound that echoed like the grinding of metal on bone, and raised its free hand. Shadows erupted from the cracks in the floor, forming tendrils that lashed out at Lucas, their movements swift and serpentine. He dodged the first few, but one caught his arm, its icy touch burning his skin. Pain shot through him, but he refused to yield. As the tendrils closed in, Lucas noticed something glinting faintly in the sludge near his feet, a fragment of the pocket watch. It pulsed with a faint light, barely visible against the surrounding darkness. Desperate, he lunged for it, his fingers closing around the shard just as a tendril wrapped around his leg. The moment he touched the fragment, a surge of warmth coursed through him, cutting through the cold that had gripped his body. The shard seemed to resonate with his heartbeat, growing brighter with each passing second. The skeletal figure recoiled slightly, its many faces twisting in rage. "That doesn't belong to you," it roared, its voice shaking the very walls. Lucas ignored the creature's fury, clutching the shard tightly as its light grew stronger, illuminating the room. The tendrils hesitated, their movements slowing as if paralyzed by the light. Lucas pushed himself to his feet, the shard in his hand glowing like a beacon. He realized then that the pocket watch wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a symbol of resistance, a reminder of the workers who had fought against the factory's darkness. With newfound determination, Lucas charged toward the skeletal figure, the shard blazing like a miniature sun. The entity screamed, its many faces writhing in agony as the light seared through its form. It swung its massive claws at Lucas, but the shard's light deflected the attack, sending ripples of energy through the room. Lucas pressed on, the light intensifying until it consumed everything around him. The walls of the factory began to collapse, their surfaces crumbling into ash as the machinery ground to a halt. The skeletal figure staggered, its once imposing form now flickering and unstable. "You cannot destroy me," it bellowed, its voice desperate and fractured. "The factory will never die." Lucas stopped just short of the entity, holding the shard aloft. The light pulsed one final time, engulfing both him and the creature in a blinding explosion. When the light faded, Lucas found himself standing alone in the ruins of the factory. The walls were gone, replaced by open sky, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The ground beneath him was littered with fragments of machinery, their edges dull and lifeless. The rhythmic thumping was gone, replaced by an almost deafening silence. Lucas exhaled, his breath visible in the cool morning air, and looked down at the shard in his hand. It had lost its glow, now nothing more than a piece of broken metal. As he turned to leave, Lucas felt a strange sensation, a pull faint but persistent. He looked back at the ruins and saw a single shadow lingering, its form indistinct but unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Lucas knew it was watching him. The factory was gone, but its essence remained, a reminder that its hunger could never be fully extinguished. Lucas walked away, the shard still clutched in his hand, knowing that while he had won this battle, the fight against the darkness was far from over. The ruins of the factory were eerily still, their silence a stark contrast to the chaos that had once consumed them. The dawn's light bathed the crumbled walls and broken machinery, but the air felt far from cleansed. It carried an unshakable heaviness, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that something unnatural had taken root here and had not been entirely eradicated. Lucas stood at the edge of the debris, his breathing labored, his body trembling from exhaustion. The shard of the pocket watch was still in his grasp, its once blazing light now dull and lifeless, but its weight felt heavier than before. As Lucas turned to leave, his instincts screamed at him to look back one last time. Reluctantly, he glanced over his shoulder. The sight froze him in place. Amidst the ruins, where the skeletal figure had stood moments before, a faint shadow lingered, its form formless yet pulsating like a living thing. It shifted and writhed, coalescing into shapes that almost resembled faces, angry, sorrowful, accusatory. Lucas felt his chest tighten as whispers began to creep back into his ears, faint and fragmented, as though carried by the wind. "This isn't over." The words were faint, almost imperceptible, but Lucas knew they weren't imagined. The shadow seemed to recede into the earth, leaving behind an ominous scar, a darkened, circular patch where the factory's heart had once pulsed. As Lucas stared at it, a strange sensation washed over him, not fear but inevitability. Whatever malevolent force had controlled the factory wasn't destroyed. It had merely retreated, waiting, plotting. He turned away, forcing himself to move. Each step felt like a monumental effort, the weight of the pocket watch shard pulling him down, as if it carried a piece of the factory's soul. The whispers faded as he walked, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The air around him remained unnaturally cold, even as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Hours later, Lucas found himself back in his apartment, the safety of the familiar walls offering little comfort. He placed the shard on his desk, its metallic surface reflecting the dim light of his desk lamp. As he stared at it, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows in the corners stretching unnaturally. He shook his head, dismissing it as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But as he leaned closer to examine the shard, a faint ticking sound reached his ears. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and impossibly familiar. Lucas's heart sank. The pocket watch was gone. He had seen it shatter with his own eyes, but the ticking persisted, growing louder with each passing second. He reached for the shard, his fingers brushing against its cold surface. The ticking stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "We are not finished, Lucas." He recoiled, his chair scraping against the floor. The shard began to glow faintly, its dull surface now pulsing with a sickly green light. Shadows flickered along the walls of the room, and the whispers returned, overlapping and chaotic. Lucas clutched his head, the cacophony growing louder, more insistent. He staggered to his feet, knocking over the desk lamp, which shattered on the floor. In the darkness, the shard's glow intensified, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant, the same voice that had haunted him in the factory. "You thought you could escape, but the factory is eternal. Its heart beats in you now." The realization hit Lucas like a blow. He wasn't free. The factory hadn't been destroyed. It had marked him, bound him to its darkness. The shadows in the room began to move, creeping closer, their forms growing more defined. Lucas stumbled back, his eyes darting around for an escape, but the shadows encircled him, their movements synchronized like predators closing in on their prey. The shard's glow became blinding, its light searing into his mind, flooding him with images. The skeletal figures' faces, the workers' anguished cries, the endless corridors of the factory. Each vision was more vivid than the last, each one a reminder of the horrors he had unleashed. The voice returned, calm now, almost mocking. "You are part of us, Lucas. You always were." The shard shattered into dust, its glow extinguished, but the shadows remained. They stopped inches from Lucas, their forms still but their presence overwhelming. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they receded, melting back into the walls, leaving the room silent once more. Lucas collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his mind reeling. The factory was gone, but its essence lived on, tethered to him in ways he couldn't fully understand. He looked at his hands, expecting to see them stained with the black sludge, but they were clean. The only evidence of what had transpired was the faint ticking sound that now seemed to emanate from within him, steady and unrelenting. As he sat there, bathed in the dim light of dawn filtering through his window, Lucas realized the horrifying truth. The factory's hunger wasn't confined to its walls. It had claimed him as its vessel, a carrier of its curse. Wherever he went, the whispers would follow, the shadows would linger, and the ticking would remind him that time was no longer his own. In the corner of the room, a faint outline began to form, a shadow, human-like but distorted, watching him silently. Lucas met its gaze, his fear giving way to resignation. The mystery of the factory remained, but he understood one thing with chilling clarity: it was not over. It would never be over,